Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Redeemer City Church. We're so glad you're here and decided to join us this morning. So if you would, make your way towards your seats, and then you can stand and join us as we begin. Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly trust in Jesus' name. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong in the Savior's love. Through the storm, He is Lord, Lord of all. When darkness seems to hide His face, I rest on His unchanging grace. In every high and stormy gale, my anchor holds within the veil. My anchor holds within the veil. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong in the Savior's love. And through the storm, He is Lord, Lord of all. When He shall come with trumpet sound, oh, may I then in Him be found, dressed in His righteousness alone, faultless to stand before the throne. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong in the Savior's love. Through the storm, He is Lord, Lord of all. Lord of all. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong in the Savior's love. And through the storm, He is Lord, Lord of all. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong in the Savior's love. And through the storm, He is Lord, Lord of all. God, we praise You this morning together as a church body, God, as brothers and sisters together. Lord, we thank You for allowing us to be here today to join together and praise You. God, we're so thankful that George Yancey is here to speak today, God, and to speak some truth to us in words that are inspired by You, God, and that we would learn more about You today, God, and we're just so thankful for everything You've given us and everything You've done for us and everything You will do for us. It's in Your name we pray. Amen. Thank you. You may be seated.
Good morning, everyone. Redeemer kids are dismissed at this time. So all of our kids and volunteers will get ready to make their way out for a great morning of learning the Word together, having fun together. It's great to see all of you guys here this morning on this beautiful Sunday afternoon. I'm sorry, not afternoon, morning. Getting ahead of myself. On this beautiful Sunday morning, great to see all of you guys here with us this morning. Whether today is your first time here with us at Redeemer City Church or you are one of our members, regular attenders, I just want to say how happy I am to see you guys. What a joy it is to see you. What a joy and privilege it is to get to worship with you this morning. As we worship together through music we've just done, and as we are going to continue worshiping together through the listening of the word being proclaimed. So it is great to see you guys here with us this morning. If today is your first time here with us at Redeemer City Church, let me encourage you before you leave today to stop by our welcome table, which is right there next to the door that you came in. Talk to our awesome guest services volunteers. Fill out one of our Connect cards, and whenever you fill out that Connect card, we have a free gift that we would like to give you, just to say thank you for joining us here at Redeemer City Church today. On that card, you could also put down if you are interested in getting any more information about the church. If you have any questions about our church, questions about even Christianity in general, anything at all, put those on that card, and we would love to be able to reach out to you to get you that information, or hopefully maybe be able to answer that question that you have that's on your mind. So once again, if it's your first time here with us, let me encourage you to stop by there and check out that table. Other than that, I want to remind you that next Sunday is going to be the first Sunday of April, and so that means that we'll be having a Next Steps class next Sunday. So if you've been here at Redeemer for a little while and you're interested in starting the membership process or becoming a member over here, or if you're even thinking, what is a member? What does it mean to be a member of our church? Let me encourage you to stick around after service next Sunday for our Next Steps class. The Next Steps class is not our whole membership process. What it is it's just a short meeting right after the worship service. It lasts about 10 minutes or so. A short meeting, and all we do is we explain to you what our membership process looks like over here at Redeemer City Church. Eli will be leading that. He can answer any questions that you might have about the membership process, about what membership means. And then at the end of that meeting, you can decide whether you want to get started in the process or whether you want to wait. It's non-committal. We don't pressure you into getting started. We have people do both all the time. Over the years at Redeemer, we've had people who they're ready to go, they get started. Others who say, I'm glad I got this information, I'm not quite ready. They wait a few months, and then they get started. Either way is fine. We want you to be able to get started whenever you're ready. And so, but no matter where you are, let me encourage you, stick around for that Next Steps class. Next Sunday, it'll be right after our worship service, and you can learn more and even get started if you are so interested. So, I am really excited about today. You guys know I have been looking forward to this Sunday. This is a really special Sunday, not just because, here in our young history at Redeemer City Church, this is actually the first time we've brought in a guest speaker from someone who's not just, one of our friends here in town, but it's our first time bringing a guest speaker, but it's also a very special guest speaker. You guys know that I love George Yancey. I've been talking him up over the past several weeks and encouraging you guys to check him out. I have been greatly blessed by his work, by his voice. I've learned and grown a lot through it. I continue to be challenged and learn through his work. And so I've been really, really looking forward to this Sunday. It is great to have him here. He's going to be here today talking on a topic related to his newest book, which is Beyond Racial Division. We're going to have a time later in the service for Q&A. So we wanted today to have an interactive element since we'll be having George here and having a special worship service. So we're going to be having a Q&A session. The way to participate in that Q&A, if you want to submit a question, is we're going to be doing it through texting in questions. Okay? So if you did not get one of those little instruction slips on your way in, with how you can text in your questions, go ahead and raise your hand now. If anybody didn't get one of those slips, we got one in the back. On that slip, it'll tell you how to do so. You just need to text Redeemer to 97,000 because you have to opt in first for us to be able to receive your messages, okay? So text Redeemer to 97,000. I'd encourage you to go ahead and do that now. So that if during the service you have a question, you want to shoot it in, you don't have to do this in the middle. So go ahead and text Redeemer to 97,000 so you can opt in. After that, wherever you send your question into that number, we will get it in our inbox. And so during that Q&A, I'll be up here with George, and I'll be able to receive those questions. I apologize if I don't be able to get to all of them, but we'll do our best to get your questions in, so we'll have that interactive time then. Okay? So once again, text Redeemer to 97,000. After that, whenever you text in your question, it'll come into our inbox. Okay? Also, George has a PowerPoint that he is going to be have some points up on the screens. If at any time you have trouble seeing the text on the screens, Eli wanted me to remind you guys that if you go back on YouTube or Facebook and watch the live stream, we have the PowerPoint slides in our live stream as well, so they might be easier for you to read there. Okay, so just in case anybody's taking notes and you miss a slide or you have trouble seeing it, you can go back in the live stream and be able to see all of them there, because through the magic of technology and our techno wizards back there, they have it on the screen with the live stream, okay? All righty. Well, let me introduce George and then we'll welcome him up. George Yancey is a scholar on race and religion in America. He holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Texas and began his career studying interracial relationships in multi-ethnic churches. Since 2019, he has been at Baylor University working on a joint appointment in sociology and the Institute of Religious Studies. He's the author of several books, including So Many Christians, So Few Lions, Beyond Racial Gridlock, and his newest book, which we'll be talking about today, Beyond Racial Division, a unifying alternative to colorblindness and anti-racism. Would you guys give a warm welcome to George?
Hello, everyone. Let me ask just a simple question. If what we believe about Christ, what we believe about Christianity is true, why do we sound like everyone else when it comes to racial issues? Why? Now, I'm not picking on any side, because when I hear Christians talk about race, it sounds like what I hear from other people talk about race, except we put a Christian veneer on it. Should we not be offering something that's different on a moral issue, such as race and ethnicity, such as racism? This is not about math. I mean, yeah, Christians talk about math the way everyone else does. 2 + 2 is 4. This is a moral issue. Why do we sound like everyone else? I don't think we should. I don't think we have to. And that's what I want to talk to you all about. Okay, so my title is, can Christianity offer us anything unique about racism? In other words, does being a Christian matter as I consider racial issues? Or is it like math? That my Christian faith, while it matters in other things, doesn't matter when it comes to math, doesn't matter when it comes to racism. And to let you know a little bit about myself, I am a Christian, I'm a sociologist, I'm a scientist, and I believe that good theology and good science go together. And when they don't, you either have bad theology or you have bad science. And there's examples of both. Sometimes you have both bad theology and bad science. All right? So if what my claim is through that my Christian faith gives me an insight that I may normally miss, there should be science that backs it up. So I'm going to give you a presentation that is part science and part theology. So you get 2 for the price of 1, if you will. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. How do we want to do the clicker? Just point at you and, all right. All right, we live in a racialized society. And a racialized society, the definition of that is a society wherein race matters profoundly for differences in life experiences, life opportunities, and social relationships. All this means is that race matters. It matters to me as I go through society. It matters as far as the opportunities I'm going to get. Sometimes the opportunities are going to be good. You know, when I was younger, I could walk on a basketball court and they say, hey, there's a black guy. I want him on my team. Sometimes the opportunities may not be so good. Being followed in a store because people might think I might be stealing something. It just matters. It matters my social relationships. People react to me a certain way. Now, it's not just because I'm an African American. It matters for all of us in our social relationships. People react to you because of your race in a certain way that they may not normally react to you. Race matters. We know that in our society it's mattered negatively for a long time for certain people. We've had centuries of racial abuse. We also know that a lot of those laws, thank God, are no longer on the books. So what do we do now in this racialized society? We had centuries of racial abuse. But now we're saying that's all bad. How do we recover from that? That's the question that we have to deal with. And to deal with that, there's two contrasting views about racism. The first one is this, that racism is something that is overt and only done from one individual to another individual. It's racist if I treat you differently because of your race. As a professor, if I say, my white students, I'm taking 5 points off their exams just because I don't like white people. People say racist, racist, racist. If I use racial epithets to insult people, racist, 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 one individual to another individual. Given that, the solution is what some people call colorblindness, to ignore race, to say race no longer matters. That's the solution if this is your definition of racism and this is your perception. If we wake up tomorrow and everyone's green, first thing, everyone gets to Hulk out. Second thing, we say there's no more racial problems because we're all the same race, we're all the same color. This is a quasi-dream of the colorblindness perspective. We ignore race as much as possible. We can't ignore it completely, but as much as possible, we ignore race. That's one solution to this. We've had centuries of racial abuse. What do you do now? We ignore race. The way you defeat racism is you defeat racism. A second perspective. Racism is structural as well as individualistic, and social institutions can perpetuate racism even when individuals do not intend to be racist. So we can't just ignore race. We have to look at how racism has impacted our social institutions. It doesn't matter whether the individual, well, it matters, but even if the individual, his or herself, is not racist, these institutions then impact marginalized people of color. So we have to tackle racism by being very proactive. Today, this is called anti-racism. Anti-racism is not new, it's just we use different terms in the past. Interracial group encounters, confrontations, that sort of stuff. Today we call it anti-racism because that's the common term of art that we're using right now. That's another way of dealing with racism. So let's look at these one at a time. First, I want to look at colorblindness. I want to ask the question, is colorblindness viable? Now, colorblindness basically says that we ignore racism, we ignore race, and that ends racism. This can make a certain amount of sense if we generally have a fair society. Because you can say, well, if we generally are fair, then we can ignore these differences, doesn't make that big of a difference. But if society is not fair, if there are wounds in our society, what do we know about ignoring wounds? Do they get better or they get worse? They get worse. If you don't treat a wound, it gets worse. So we have to ask the question, are there wounds continuing in our society that need treatment, that need our attention? Now here's what research says, and there is reams of research that will demonstrate this. I'm just doing 4 studies right now because time. We could spend the next half an hour going up to study. If I prepare, I could go spend the next half an hour. I teach a race ethnicity course. I have class periods where I go into a lot of research on this. But I want to show you that we still have these wounds. First study. There's no decrease in racial discrimination in hiring over the past 25 years. We know this through something called an audit study. An audit study is when you take an African American or a Hispanic American and a European American and they both apply for a job. I won't get too complicated, but you do what you can to even out the applications except for their race. And what we know is that the European American candidate will be called back for the interview more than the African American or the Hispanic American candidate. Now this study came out in 2017. It's one thing you say, all right, in 2017 they're called back, say 10% of the time, but when we look back, because what they did was what we call a meta-analysis. I'm trying not to get too nerdy on you. So you may know what these terms mean. A meta-analysis means you look at a lot of different studies, all right? That's all it means. So they looked at studies over 25 years. There's one thing they said, in 2017 we found that 10% of the time, 10% more of the time, the white person is called back. But in 2010, it was 20% of the time. We're improving. But look at this again. It's not decrease. Over the past 25 years, racial discrimination, when it concerns being called back for a job, has not decreased. The wound is still going. Second study. Driving while black. Now, you probably have heard of it. This seems to be a pretty young group, so you all probably have heard the term driving while black. The African Americans are pulled over more than European Americans. This study was in Ohio. There's other studies in other states. We know this is true. Now, they know this because what they'll do is they'll observe, they'll look at how often people are pulled over in their race, and they'll observe people driving, because it could be that blacks drive faster than whites. But the sad news is, we are as bad at drivers as white people are. So, and here's the final nail in the coffin, if you will, to driving while black is a real thing. The one time where they don't find driving while black happen is at night. And at night is when you have a harder time seeing the race of people in cars. So you can look at this and say, it is inconvenient and it may cost you some money a ticket, but is it really that big of a deal? Well, I put this study because it connects to a large framework of studies that look at our criminal justice system. And we know that all other things being equal, when we equalize things, and we use our stats to equalize things, that if you're an African American or Hispanic American, all things being equal, you're more likely to be arrested. All other things being equal, you're more likely to be charged. All other things being equal, you're more likely to be put into a trial. You have to go to trial. And we also know that if you're convicted, all other things being equal, you're going to serve a longer sentence. Okay, next study, please. Residential segregation. Now, I know that we're in this paradise called Louisiana. You know, this is great weather. I mean, if y'all get this year round, boy, wow. We should have more people moving here because this weather's great. So y'all probably don't have residential segregation. You know, you probably are pretty, you know. But in other states that are not paradise Louisiana, we do have residential segregation. We know this residential segregation impacts educational outcomes. So if you have a black area of town, you have a black school, right? Because the kids in the black area of town, they go to the same neighborhood school. White area of town, Hispanic area of town. And because of this, we know that the schools vary in quality. So the black schools don't do as well as the white schools. What this means is if you're a black kid, you go to a black school, you're going to an inferior school, which is going to impact your chance, of course, to go on to college and things of this nature. For reasons I won't go into, I didn't go to a black school when I went to high school. I went to a Hispanic school. What was interesting is there was a black school, I just didn't go to it. There's also a couple of white schools. When I went off to college, I met a lot of people from my hometown, they went to the white school. Why didn't kids from my mostly Hispanic school come to college with me? My Hispanic school was good at one thing really well, industrial arts. We built a home every year. So the kids they were concentrating on teaching these kids on how to lay bricks and do carpentry and do plumbing and all this sort of stuff. Nothing wrong with that, good paying jobs. But who's going to run the country? People who lay bricks or people who go to college? So in a sense, what the Hispanic school was doing was, y'all don't need college that much. We'll teach you a trade, we'll teach you how to build a home. Next one. And our medical health care. This came out of a study. They actually looked at 37 studies. About 26 of them had solid evidence of racism in our healthcare system. Sometimes it was how people were treated. Sometimes it was what they were prescribed, things of this nature. So in our healthcare system, African Americans and Hispanic Americans go through it, and they experience this racism. They may not always be able to know exactly what it is, but they're experiencing it. You want to know at least one of the reasons why African Americans and Hispanic Americans were less likely to get COVID vaccinations over this past couple of years? They don't trust our healthcare system because they experience racism in it. And for those of you who know about the Tuskegee experiment, you know, obviously we don't have anything quite that egregious that I know of at this point in time, but that's part of, I still talk to African Americans and say, well, I'm going to the doctor because of the Tuskegee experiment. So we do have these gaping wounds. So when you tell a person of color just ignore race. We'll just treat everyone the same, but just ignore race. And these wounds are still here. The wound is not healing. It's getting worse. Colorblindness doesn't work. Brings us to anti-racism. Okay, so what was anti-racism? Here's how I prepared for my book to understand anti-racism. I didn't want to study academics and, because we sometimes talk about stuff and in the general public people are going, huh? So I didn't want to do that. I want to read the popular anti-racism books that were there. At the time, the two most popular books on the New York Times bestseller list and on Amazon, you probably remember this about 2020, was How to Be an Anti-Racist and White Fragility. So I read those books. Also read books such as So You Want to Talk About Race, Me and White Supremacy, things of this nature. So I wanted to read these books and find what are the common threads that was tying this philosophy together. So I know what people are talking about when they talk about anti-racism, what they're reading about. So here's 3 threads that I feel really tie these books together. The first one is very proactive in dealing with racism. So we don't wait and see what's going to happen. We tackle racism. We go after racism. We aren't just going to sit back. We're going to see where racism is, and we're going to go after it. Very proactive. All these books are very proactive. You don't sit back. You have to confront racism. Second point, working to dismantle all aspects of racism. So these books talk about how racism is multifaceted. It's not just the individual. It's systematic. It's institutional. It's in a lot of different, it's not in just one or two institutions. It's in a lot of different, our economic institutions, our education, our families, so forth and so on. So multifaceted and proactive. And honestly, these first 2 principles, I say, you know what? This sounds like a good beginning. It's this third principle that's problematic. And that's this. And the responsibility of whites is to do what people of color want. Now, people don't say it quite that way. But let's just break it down for a second. What is white fragility? Read White Fragility if you haven't done that. And she states what whites are to do is to listen to people of color and then say they'll try to do better. Read How to Be an Anti-Racist. Kinney lays out, this is what anti-racism is, and we expect people, what he as an African-American person has devised, and we expect people to follow it. Read these books. Some of them talk about, I think Me and White Supremacy talked about how they expect whites to support them financially, their activism, and to convince other whites of anti-racism. There is no attempt at dialogue here. Whites, this is what you're supposed to do. That's problematic. And I'll show you why. Let's ask, is this approach successful? Because I know why a lot of people feel this is a great approach. But as a scholar, I have to ask, does this actually work? And remember, this is not something that is new. We've had this for decades now, all right? Some form of anti-racism. So there's a lot of research on it. And one final thing before we look at the research. Think about who's doing the research. The people doing the research are not wearing MAGA hats. These are people who are pretty progressive, even radical in their racial approach. So what does the research say? First thing, when it comes to one of the things they talk about, diversity training, I forgot, I still had this in here. One of the claims made is that bias is implicit, but the implicit test of bias is really flawed. I won't go that much into that, but go ahead, go to the next one. Diversity training. We can change people's perspective through diversity training, through telling them what to do, right? Well, actually, we can't. Diversity training has little long-term effect on prejudice. What we find is that if you could do some sort of training and immediately afterwards, you see a reduction in prejudice. You come 6 months later, it's gone back to its normal levels. It's like this. You send your kid off to Bible school. Kid comes back, and the kid is making up his bed, and the kid is eating his vegetables, and the kid is respectful, And then 6 months later, the kid's bed's a mess. Kid won't touch the vegetables. The kid's no longer respectful. It didn't take, right? That's diversity training. It doesn't take. It doesn't really change. It makes people maybe feel guilty for a little while, and then they go back to normal. Next one, please. Now, a big topic in anti-racism is privilege, white privilege. And what we know is, from this study, is that when you teach about white privilege, you don't necessarily create more sympathy for people of color. The idea is we teach about white privilege and people will go, oh, this is why people of color are struggling. But what you do is you create less sympathy for marginalized whites. So now people are asking questions such as, well, why are those whites homeless? They have white privilege. Why are they on drugs? They have white privilege. What's happening is if you teach about privilege badly, you create less sympathy for marginalized people. Because no more sympathy for people, marginalized people of color, less sympathy for marginalized whites. Next one. Anti-racism approaches actually can lead to declines in hiring of minority groups. This is a really interesting study from Dobbins et al. What they did was they went to companies and they looked at how many, the percentage of managers, not workers, managers were people of color. They looked at what techniques they were using to increase the number of people of color in managers. They went away and came back 5 years later, and they looked at whether or not they increased the managers of color. And they found that when you use things such as mandatory diversity training, grievance committees, trying to shape the job hiring process directly, you actually have fewer managers of color 5 years later. When you engage in a conversation with those managers of color and have them work with you, you actually had more. One more, please. Oh, I guess not one more. Okay, so why is this not working? Well, there's a truth that both approaches lack, and that's this: human depravity. Here's where I'm gonna get into a little bit of theology. All right, so think about this. Both colorblindness and anti-racism have one critical thing in common. Both of them are philosophies that tell you, look, we have figured it out, you need to do what we're telling you to do. You need to ignore race, you need to engage in anti-racism. What this does is it assumes that you have overcome human depravity enough to clearly see everything. And that's why I think they both fail. They look at human depravity in other individuals, perhaps, but human depravity starts when I begin to look at it in myself. If I'm only looking at human depravity in other people, then I don't get what human depravity is. It's not that I've figured it out and everyone else has not. It's that none of us have figured it out. And it is the key to our Christian faith when we think about it, because if we don't have human depravity, why do we need to be saved? This is not just some sort of minor tenet of Christianity. We don't talk about that much, understandably so. We don't like to talk about how depraved we are, but it is a major tenet. Whenever we talk about needing to save people, we're talking about saving them because of human depravity. There's scriptural backing of human depravity. And here's just some verses. You see Genesis 6:5. The Lord saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and every intention, thoughts of his heart was evil continuously. Romans 3:10-11. None is righteous, no, not one. No one understands, no one sees for God. And 1 Corinthians 2:14. The natural person does not accept the things of the Spirit of God. For their fault. I mean, we can go through the Bible and find it is a core element of our Christian faith. It is a core factor in that relationship. Now, to really understand the difference between this and what we're seeing, I need to go take it back to my graduate school. Because in graduate school, I learned about a very important concept known as human perfectibility. So, yeah, go to the next slide, please. This emerged from the Enlightenment movement. The notion of the Enlightenment movement was we need to transcend beyond the traditional religions, and we have evolved to a state where we can perfect society and create perfect humans. Well, maybe not perfect, but at least better humans. We can create a better society as a reliance on human ability in order to achieve the goals that was before them. Because in the Enlightenment movement, we're not relying on God, the church. They're reacting against the Catholic Church. We're not relying on that. We're relying on our own human abilities to achieve human perfectibility. All right, so humans will become better with education was one of the aspects. When we figure out what's happening, we'll educate people, and then people will figure out, through that education, people become better. Humans are rational creatures that can be convinced to become better. There's a assumption of rationality. Now, at the time, when I was in graduate school, I didn't have kids. So I did not know how flawed that assumption was. But there is a assumption of rationality that if humans can see that this is a better approach and we can appeal to their rationality, they'll accept it, and then they will help us to create this better society. Now, one way to think about this, those of you who are familiar with, say, Marxism, if you're familiar with the ideas of Marxism, that Marx believes that this revolution that's going to come is going to upset the system and people will create this better utopian society. And it's not just about the economics. True Marxism, the economics sets up everything else that's going to be great and good. And this is not to say that the entire Enlightenment movement was Marxist, but they had similar ideas that if we could change society, we can create this utopia. We know we have directions. We know we can educate people. People are rational. We can move forward. And you can really see this if you pay attention to how people make arguments today along these ways. As it concerns race, if our insight, be it anti-racism or colorblindness, is adopted, then we can move towards the end of racial alienation. So what you hear is, look, in a sense, they're doing this. They're saying, look, we figured it out. You adopt our philosophy, and we'll end racial alienation. Now, it's really clear when we look with the anti-racism literature that that's what they're doing. Some people may not see in the colorblindness, but it's clear there too. Just to give you an example, about a year and a half ago, I have 3 kids, a 6, 5, and 3-year-old. Yeah, y'all can go, how? I don't know, God, okay? And about a year and a half ago, I was thinking about talking to my oldest kid about racial issues. Now, I know I'm a race scholar, but it was the first time in my life I had a 5-year-old. So, I have all this training on race, but how do you talk to a 5-year-old about these issues, and how do you do it in a way that's healthy and all this other stuff? So I went to that fountain of knowledge to figure it out, Facebook. Now, in all honesty, I know that I sometimes post stuff that gets people's blood flowing, but I just wanted to post, I just wanted to reach out to some of my friends who are also raising kids of color and say, hi, how do y'all approach talking about racial issues? So I just made a little post about that. Thought it was a pretty innocent post, thought I'd get some advice, and I got a few people who say, well, this is what I do. But I also got a lot of pushback for that. I said, all the things I post, why that? I got pushback from people who said, why are you trying to raise good black men? My kids are all boys. Just try to raise good Christian men. And that's all you have to worry about. Why are you bringing up race? Why do you talk about race with your kids? Now, at first it was like, why do you, you raise your kids, what is all this? And then I realized, for these individuals, they're so married to the colorblindness perspective that someone else not raising their kids colorblind is a threat. The solution is everyone raise their kids colorblind and we solve the whole problem. Both of these philosophies are, we have the answers, you need to follow our answers. Now contrast this with human depravity. Human depravity says this, humans are inherently selfish, and that cannot be taken away with education. There's a really interesting study out there, research did this. So when we do surveys with whites, one thing we found, one thing that is like the bedrock of these surveys is the more education whites have, the less racist they are. So question after question after question, wherever it deals with race, the more education whites have, the less racist they are. So I had a couple of colleagues that said, that's interesting. Be careful when a sociologist says, that's interesting. So what they did was they looked at the surveys and they said, okay, here's this survey. It says that the more education whites are, the more willing they are to send their kids to schools that are racially integrated. That's what the survey says. And this other survey says the more educated whites are, the more willing they are to live in integrated neighborhoods. That's what the survey says. So let's see where whites send their kids and live. So they got data. And what they found out that among whites, the more educated they are, after controls such as income, so this is not an income effect, and other things, sex and region and all that other stuff, the more educated whites are, the less likely they are to send their kids to integrated school, and the less likely they are to live in an integrated neighborhood. It's as if education doesn't make whites morally better, but teaches them how to hide their sin. Education, and I'm sure this effect is not just on whites, education doesn't necessarily make us morally better. I'm an educator, I'm not anti-education, but some pretty immoral people are highly educated as well. Next one. So education is not going to do it. Only accounting by our desire to protect our own self-interest can we deal with group conflict. Let's realize this is human depravity. We are all deprived. In every racial group, including my own, we have human depravity. So we do not account for the fact that we tend to want to protect ourselves and our group, then we can't get past this group conflict. The conflict is not going to end by certain groups saying, you guys need to conform to what we are saying. That's not going to end it. Because even if people do conform, that group itself suffers from human depravity. So, only holding each other accountable can we find solutions for racial alienation. What I'm arguing is we cannot find solutions by winning the war that we're having with each other. We find solutions by finding ways to work together. Some people have said, is this a path in between anti-racism and colorblindness? And I say no. This is a qualitatively different direction. I'm not saying let's be half colorblind, let's be half anti-racist. There'll be times where we should be all anti-racist, or maybe times we should be all colorblind. But that has to be worked out together. This is a qualitatively different approach, because it's not about winning what I want. It's about finding ways we can live together. And that's how we have to head it. A mutual accountability approach, then. Go ahead. Is a Christian-based approach. Now, let me stop for a second. Does that mean only Christians can do it? No. I would say forgiveness is a Christian-based approach, but research has shown that whether you're a Christian or not, people who forgive are healthier. So I will be happy to have a talk like this without the Bible verses and everything, based purely on my academic understanding to a non-Christian group. Absolutely. And bring them aboard. Christian-based approach, whereby we recognize that people of all races have a sin nature that has to be accounted for. Thus, everyone has to work towards healthy interracial communication to solve racial problems. If I had an elevator speech on what my book is about, the elevator speech, you enter an elevator, you're on the 5th floor. So it says, oh, you wrote a book. What's it about? You got to the 1st floor to tell them what it's about. Elevator speech. Hey, elevator speech is like, I think the best way to solve racial relations is to learn how we can communicate better so we can find compromises and work together. That'd be my elevator speech on race relations. And then if they want to follow up, then you go more in depth. Why I don't think it's already happening, some of the problems, some of the techniques, things of this nature. That's basically it. Because do we truly have honest conversations on race in our country today? And asking the question almost answers the question. Because if we did, we wouldn't be in the situation we are. Now, I looked at the empirical work at the others. Is there empirical work on this? So, yes. Under the right conditions, we know that interracial contact helps alleviate bias. So, the more we're together, under the right conditions, we actually have less bias towards one another. Polarizing each other so we don't interact with each other is counterproductive. Next one, please. Having a common group identity also increases positive feelings. So all this means is the more we can identify, have a group identity. I guess one of the ways to think about it is a couple years ago, wasn't LSU the national football champions in college football? Is that a sore spot here because you all are Lafayette or not? I mean, okay, all right. I'm just making sure, I have to know my audience to know whether, I say, hey, this is a great thing, and then the audience is like looking at me with stab eyes, and that's not good. But in this state, wasn't there like a kind of a group identity? Like if you went to LSU a football game, or if you watch on TV with friends, wasn't, hey, we're in it together kind of deal? No matter what the other person was, by their race or religion or whatever, there's just that group identity kind of unifies us, right? The more we have that, a church naturally should have that. A church, as Christians, we should naturally build upon that. And so what we should be doing is trying to create more of a group identity with as many people as possible. That's the direction for us to go because it helps to increase positive feelings. You feel good towards that other. Do y'all have like those tiger finger things where you just, hey, that person, yeah, I'm with that person. Yeah, go Tigers, go Tigers. Okay, next one. Okay, perspective taking. Perspective taking is shown to be effective in long-term change in behaviors. When we learn how to take the perspectives of others, that's very effective in long-term change. If I can learn how to understand the perspective of people who are different races than me, that creates long-term change. When we get polarized, when we think I have the right answers, I gotta force it on you, I'm not perspective taking, I'm trying to force you into what I believe. Instead of trying to understand where you are coming from so that we can work together. Next one. Collaborative communications in an atmosphere of mutual support creates volitional compliance. Now, think about what's been happening in Virginia and in Texas and in some other states where we've had these state school boards and we've had all this protest happening and people are protesting what they call critical race theory and all that sort of stuff. Here's one way to look at it. In 2020, some of these school boards, I think, look at the racial problems we have. We gotta do something about it. So they put things into their curriculum. Now, I'm not gonna go into whether it's critical race theory or not. To me, that's not that important. They put certain things into the curriculum. They did so because they thought it was the right thing to do. They thought they had the power to do it. And other individuals had their critiques, to put it mildly, of what they were placing in there. They'd never really been consulted. They'd never been talked to about it. They said, this is what we're going to teach. So they got mad, and now they started protesting. In Virginia, they basically helped to elect the new Republican governor, right? That was a big issue in Virginia. They're probably going to get rid of some school board members. Why bring this up? You could have a great solution, and I'm not making a judgment on the solution whether it's good or not. I'm just saying, let's assume it's a great solution. But if you don't get volitional compliance, your solution can be out the window in 2 years. What you want to do is you want to build compliance. You want to have everyone feel like they had a say on board. Perhaps approach a different way. People can say, well, I have a problem with this, and you could change that thing and still get a lot of what you want. Or you can just try to get it all, and you can get what you got in Virginia. Skill development is the key to successful diversity training. Diversity training generally is not useful, but when it is, it's because we develop skills rather than tell people what to think. We develop true critical thinking skills rather than telling people what to think. We need a new way of approaching things, a new approach than what we've been doing. Collaborative conversation, learning how to talk to one another, and learn how to move forward is vital in that new approach. So, let me finish with just some implications of this approach. I know that it's still somewhat nebulous because of my time, and the book does flesh it out more so, and with the card you do get 40% off, so that's my one plug. And it has a QR code, so you can get it right away if you want. But let's just talk about some implications of this approach. First, no one has all the right answers. I'm a race scholar, African American, I should have all these great answers. I'm telling you, I don't have all the right answers. I still learn. We can get better answers by listening to each other. So that's key. Yes, I should study. Yes, I should go on my own and think, but I also need to listen to other people because sometimes they give perspectives I say, okay, I hadn't thought about it that way. We need intentional efforts at collaborative conversation. What I'm not saying is, hey, let's get in a room and just talk. Unfortunately, in our society, we're so polarized. A lot of times we wind up what we see on social media. we just talk. So we have to intentionally engage in collaborative conversations. We have to intentionally talk with a goal-oriented purpose. We're trying to understand others instead of just trying to win. This is not saying that what you believe is not important and you shouldn't push it, but you need how to promote it in a better, actually more effective way. If you look at the research, I don't have time to look at the research on how you actually promote your ideas, how you persuade others. Actually, it's community building rather than polarizing. Yes. Needs of everyone must be respected. Beyond the other things, the problem with color blindness is it does not respect the needs of people of color. And the problem with anti-racism is it does not really respect the needs of whites. Because if you're telling whites, the only thing you need to do is do what people of color want, you have no respect for their needs. Everyone's needs has to be respected. Now, I want to be very clear on this. When I say mutual accountability, the mutual part is to enter into the conversation. It does not mean that solutions are going to be mutual. Solutions may well be, it may often be, that European Americans have to make more adjustments than people of color, okay? Because of our history, because of what's happened. But everyone, regardless of race, has responsibility to enter in the conversation in good faith and an attempt to understand others. That is mutual. That's the mutual part. But everyone's needs have to be respected. Skills of active listening and productive communication is to be valued. Active listening is what I do when I do qualitative work, when I interview people. I have a book out on atheists. I interviewed about 25 atheists. I was not trying to convince them that atheism is wrong. I was merely trying to listen so I could understand them, so I could get the information I needed for my book. When you are active listening, you want to understand where people are coming from, that's what you're doing. This is a skill that can be developed. It takes some work, but it can be developed. I admit I don't always do it the way I should, in my day-to-day life. So, I need to work on it more too. We all need to work on it. It should be a skill we should constantly be working on. Communication. We got to talk to people in a way they can hear us. If we don't, literally, when people feel threatened, research has shown people cannot hear what you have to say. A person feels threatened, they turn off. And their minds go to, the LSU glory years or something like that. They cannot hear you. And people have to understand this. I want to give a couple of examples of this, because I think this is a very important point, because the way we talk matters. You could be totally in the right and sin in the way that you communicate. You're totally in the right. All right? So I'm going to give an example from what I say comes from a more colorblind perspective, and one comes from a more anti-racism perspective. Here's what sometimes people with colorblind perspective say that is not useful. I don't see race. So when you say that to a person of color, I know from talking to people what you mean is, I'm not going to treat you any differently because of your race. But what you're communicating is, your racial identity does not matter to me. Now, I'm the first one to admit that my racial identity is not the most important identity. That's being a child of God. But it is important to me. It is part of who I am. It's part of what shaped me. I can't just jettison that. So that becomes threatening. And when you say it that way, a lot of times people of color cannot hear the next thing you have to say. Now here's something that comes from the other side, the anti-racism side, and that's something like this. Trafficking in white supremacy, or talking about ending whiteness, things of this nature. Because what happens to a lot of whites is they hear that, and I know that white supremacy is, the definition of it changes depending on who you talk to, and I know there's definitions that are not about personal animosity, and that's all well and good. Most people that hear white supremacy, what do they think? They think the KKK. And so when you say that, I say, but I really don't mean that you're part of the KKK. They're already gone. You chose to use a term that's going to activate that, and they're gone. And what you say next is not going to matter. So it's not just how can we listen, how can we communicate? I'll tell you what I used to say when I was doing this 15 years ago. When I was talking to a mostly white audience, I wanted them to be open to the possibilities of institutional discrimination and of subtle racism. I would not start off talking about racism. That would not cross my lips. What I would say early on in my speech, to get their attention, to make sure they pay attention to me, was talking about a study I just did. and this is true, this is an actual study I just did, that showed that for the average single white person, the race of who they dated was more important than the faith of who they dated. In other words, they're more willing to date a white atheist than a black Christian. And when I said that, I had their attention because I knew two things. One, these people were not traditional racists. These people were not, hey, you know, I mean, they're listening to a black guy, so that tells you right there that they're not, I can't be in the same room with a black person. They're not traditional racists. But second, while they may not care about racial issues, they care about their kids. And they care about their kids staying in the faith. And the idea of their kid, because they're not traditional racists, dating and marrying a white non-Christian and bypassing a Christian of color, that shocked them. Now I had their attention. Now they wanted to listen to me about racial issues if they didn't before. I was talking in the language of my listener, and that's what we have to learn how to do. And work is towards solutions that are win-win instead of win-lose. We got to escape the mentality, we're going to beat these people. It's not about beating people. It's about working with people, because they're not going away. I think there's a mentality, if we beat these people, they'll go away. They're not going away. Have you been in our country? You know, we'll have a different president in a few years, or maybe not, but still the polarization will go away. Sides are trading power. They're not going away. So why don't we learn how to work with people instead of trying to beat them down? And maybe they'll stop trying to beat us down too. And maybe we'll build community instead of polarization. Thank you for your time, and I eagerly await your questions.
Y'all can stand, and we're going to do one song, and then we'll do the Q&A in a few minutes. Y'all can stand and join me and Matt in worship. Lost in sin, held captive by my fear, till your mercy showed, your hand was reaching near. My God, you came and made a way for me. You made a way for me. Lost in sin, held captive by my fear, till your mercy showed, your hand was reaching near. My God, you came and made a way for me. You made a way for me. And my Jesus, gracious Redeemer and friend, there's nothing like your love without it. And my hope was purchased by the blood of the Lamb. My Jesus, Redeemer. Defeated death, you trampled over sin. You're the risen King, you're coming back again. My God, you came and made a way for us. You made a way for us. My Jesus, no shame, no curse, no chains, new life you gave, Redeemer, no guilt, no shame, no curse, no chains, new life you gave, Redeemer, no guilt, no shame, no curse, no chains, new life you gave, Redeemer, my debt is paid, my soul now saved, oh God, you came, Redeemer, my debt is paid, my soul now saved, oh God, you came, Redeemer, my Jesus, gracious Redeemer and friend, there's nothing like your love without it. And my hope was purchased by the blood of the Lamb. My Jesus, Redeemer.
Be seated. You may be seated. These guys are going to set up our spot. Yeah, go ahead and come up. They're going to bring out a table, and we'll sit. So we'll get this set up so we can get started. Right in the center. All right. Okay. All right. Thank you, guys. Well, this is going to be fun. This is going to be something new. We've never done a Q&A like this in our service before.
Glad to be here first.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for being willing to experiment with me here. But we already had a lot of great questions come in, and I had several of my own that I wanted to ask, and so we'll get to as many as we can, and maybe me and you can do another podcast episode, like a follow-up.
Sure.
That and get to more of the questions and some of my questions as well. So thank you guys for sending in your questions. Feel free to keep sending them in while we're talking because I can see them coming in live. So definitely feel free to shoot those in. And like I said, even if we can't get to all of them, we'll do a podcast episode with some spillover questions. So first of all, thank you for your talk today. It was great. I really enjoyed it. I finished reading George's book last week, Beyond Racial Division, and it's excellent. I highly and wholly recommend it. And so definitely take advantage of that discount that he offers with a card, so you can pick up a copy, especially if you're really looking for any of his arguments, whether that be some of his critiques, but then especially the positive arguments he puts forward. If you're looking to see any of that more fleshed out, then definitely get the book, because he goes into a lot more detail than what he can do in a 30-minute talk, obviously. So, well, let's get started with some of these questions. Like I said, we had a lot of great ones already, a lot of really practical questions. Let's start. I like these questions here. So this first one is, do biased behaviors and racism end up getting grouped together? Or I think what the question is, or does sometimes culture differentiate?
Yeah, let's see if I understand the question. Biased behaviors and racism as opposed to culture. First, I think it depends on how you define racism. You know, I think that people have different definitions. Is racism just about me acting in a biased way towards individuals, or is it more encompassing? Mm-hmm. Because if it's the second one, then biased behaviors is not necessary for racism at all. There's biased outcomes that may or may not be tied to how people actually are behaving. Their behavior may be just what they're supposed to do in society, and that just goes along. Just, for example, the school I talked about, that a school that focuses in on industrial arts as opposed to academic excellence, the people in that school, I don't think were acting in a biased way against Hispanic Americans. They're doing their jobs, basically. But the outcomes, obviously, was biased in that way. I think, and then there's a culture component to this question. I'm trying to see exactly how this fits. Does our culture, I guess maybe, I don't know, the person means, does our culture help to shape our biased behaviors? Maybe that's what they mean. And undoubtedly the answer is yes, that our culture would help us shape the biased behaviors that we do have. Our culture, people underestimate just how powerful our culture is, how we're convinced about things just because our culture says it is. So, our culture used to say that that women were intellectually inferior to men and blacks were intellectually inferior to whites and all that sort of stuff. And everyone bought it, even blacks and women bought that. So and our culture says stuff today that I think some of us as Christians say, well, that's just not true, but people buy it because of the culture. So yeah, definitely our culture shapes how we see things and how we may act out in bias.
Yeah, and that was one family with a couple of questions. Their second question, which also would like to hear, was, so how did you end up talking to your kids about race?
It is an ongoing process of figuring it out. Kind of, I say is similar to talking to your kid about sex, in that, it's an ongoing thing. It's not like, let's have the sex talk, we're done. I wish it was that way. Now, at this point, and both my wife and I, we're just figuring it out as we go along because there's not good stuff out there. I know Kendi has his anti-racism baby book, and that I'm definitely not using that. Right now, with our kids at our age, we are focusing on awareness. We're not really getting into the relationship part of it and that sort of stuff. I'm interracially married, so they can see that blacks and whites get along, usually. 99% of the time, But we're trying to bring up. So what we've done is we've taken our boys to Juneteenth celebrations, to Martin Luther King Day celebrations. Our oldest one reads, and he really reads quite well for his age. He reads a lot, and so we're getting some material for him to read. We want them to be aware of the issues of race and racism in our society historically and today, and we think that that's the stage that they're at. And that's all we got, because at this point, that's because their age is. I do think at a certain age we're going to want to talk to them about, okay, what does this mean as far as how do you relate to people? How do you work out problems? How do we illustrate this? And I do think that, given my approach, the more that we can engage, we can illustrate that in our lives, the better off we're going to be. So yeah, I don't have the answers to that. And when I do, maybe I'll write a book on that. But right now, I don't have the complete answers. We're still working it out. When our boys when they're all 18 or above and they're sharp on racial issues, I say, hey, we did a good thing, then I'll write a book on that.
Great. You're a scientist, so you always like to make sure that your methods...
My data, yeah.
Yeah, that the data's there before you
right,
promote
yes.
your methods, so
Yeah.
I understand that. Here's another good one. We're getting a lot of questions still coming in. They're all good, but I really like this one. There's a category of people that are open to mutual conversations on race, but what are ways that you think through approaching people who are not as open?
Right, very fair question. I think about half of the people in this country, about half, maybe a little bit more, are in a situation where they haven't thought much about race, or when they've looked around at colorblindness and anti-racism, they for different reasons, that it doesn't fit with them and they want something else. So I think there's half the people that are open to a conversation. I do think there's a little bit less than half, but they're there. People are either so wedded to colorblindness or so wedded to anti-racism that you really can't have a productive conversation at this point in time. And so when I run to those folks, for myself, I cannot hit my head against the wall again and again and again, I just say, God bless you, and move on. It's not unlike evangelism in that that there are people who are ready to hear and people who are not ready to hear. And they're not ready to hear, and just hitting your head against the wall just does nothing, as it maybe alienate them. You love them, you care for them, and you wait for the opportunity to come. I think we reach the half that is ready to move in this direction, and they become more active. I think we'll start cutting into the others because they'll start seeing, hey, there's something working here. I'm actually working on research right now, which I hope will really more overtly document how useful this cloud conversation approach really is. And so I hope that, it's going to take a couple of years because this is how long research takes, but I'm hoping in a few years to say, hey, look, this is actually working. And then we can go to those who are more close-minded and say, we got science directly that's showing this is benefiting. That's not going to convince everyone, but we can convince more of them. But I think we're working with about 50% that are open to having this conversation right now, to be honest. And we should start with that 50% and then see if we can move on as the process goes along.
We're getting several questions related to education, and also related to what you had talked about before, that study that showed that more educated whites were actually less likely to send their kids to integrated schools. So yes, we're getting several questions about education. I think this one might help cover them all the most. School of choice is a conservative view as the solution to having black and white, quote unquote, black and white schools that have huge funding disparities. This is opposed by the anti-racist movements. What are your thoughts on a good solution?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think there's merit to school choice as far as academics. Honestly, I think that school choice would probably help out a lot of kids better. As far as racial issues, though, I think that there are some potential downfalls to that. There's a different study that shows that there's a school choice situation. What they found out was that whites were sending their kids to schools that were predominantly white, which is not a surprise, but the reason always given is these are better schools. But in this particular case, there was a black school that was doing a little bit better than the white school. Yet the white parents are still prioritizing sending their kids to this white school that was doing worse than this black school. So I do share the concerns at school choice, even though I do think overall, academically, it probably would benefit kids overall. But I do share the concerns that it may create more racial polarization. If we had situations where we had more of a collaboration where we could understood each other better, perhaps it wouldn't be that way. But in the world we live in today, I fear that it could do that. Yeah, I see that argument.
And so as a follow-up question, what would be our roles as parents, community members, and especially we have a lot of educators here, what would be our role in that collaborative conversation when it comes to education?
So here's something that I think schools should consider. All right. I know, and I don't want to get too deep into the weeds on the critical race theory stuff because I know that that's a big topic, but you do something, critical race theory, you get protests. And whether it's critical race theory or not, people are going to protest. I think we need to talk a little bit less about doing racial justice. I'm not saying I'm against racial justice, but more about having better interracial conversations. Because I think you can get to justice through the conversations easier than you're saying, we're doing racial justice, and we're going to put this in their schools. Because that's going to trigger people. They're going to say, you're going to do critical race theory, and they're going to protest you. I think having some, and I also think that you need to bring people you need to bring the parents into the conversation. You don't need to set something up and say, this is what we're going to do, like it or leave it. That's going to get you the yelling mother at the school board meeting. So what you need to do, I think, is work on a program that is actually, and I'm actually working with a couple of colleagues to try to develop this for Christian schools, but I think it could be amenable to secular schools as well, that encourages the sort of conversations that's going to really make a difference if it's done the right way. And I think that is one of the ways. There is no silver bullet in this. There's no guarantee, and I can't say if you do this that you're not going to get some angry parents still say you're going to do CRT, but I think you're taking away at least a little bit of the of the animosity, say, look, what we want to do is, your kids are going to grow up in a society that's going to be racially diverse. We're going to learn how to get along with each other. We think it's very important that they learn how to talk to people of different races. Don't you think that's important? And I think if you have that sort of approach, you have a better chance of dealing with this than if you come in with some sort of talking about racial justice. And once it's talking about the language of the listener is incredibly important. And some people don't want to do that because they say, well, we want justice. Okay, if you want justice, this is a better way to do it than coming in and proclaiming you want justice. It's kind of like, one of my kids is kind of obstinate. So if we tell him to do something, he's going to do the opposite, So we're learning that reverse psychology trick that parents know so well. And it works sometimes. So sometimes you can't just say, we're going to do this because this is what we really want. You got to learn how to talk to people in a way they can hear you so that you can get more people on board. And so that's how, if you're an educator and you're in a situation to deal with that, to influence the process, I would consider that sort of approach more of a collaborative conversations, interracial communication approach, in order so we can understand each other and then work out our racial problems together. And by the way, let me just be clear, this is not just about so we can get along with each other. This is about how we solve problems. We learn to talk so we can solve problems. Getting along is great and to be encouraged, but that's not the ultimate goal of this. The ultimate goal of this is to solve problems.
So whenever we have these conversations, particularly within the church, because let me ask this question first. You started your talk by saying how we as Christians so often just end up parroting whatever the world says, whether that be the colorblindness approach or the anti-racism approach. And this is something else that I saw, especially during 2020, when we had a couple of different racial incidents, in the months of protests, riots, and every political upheaval after that. I started to look around at church responses, Christian responses, evangelical responses. And I looked at the world, and I looked at Christian leaders, and I saw the exact same thing. Like division, vitriol, and then online, division, vitriol. Exact same thing. Why is it that the church is just as divided as the world on racial issues?
I think that's a larger question, why the church looks like the world so much on too many issues. I think part of it is that as much as we like to say that we're a countercultural society, we often are not. And it is easier to go along with the culture in a lot of ways. Now, we'll pick a couple of issues which will be countercultural on, but then we generally go with the world instead of thinking through the ramifications of what our faith really means. And I'm not unaware of the implications of what I present, not just on racial issues, but on a lot. I mean, what if we start really believing about human depravity, that we as humans cannot figure it all out, and that we need to find ways in which we need to be held in check as much as everyone else? I think that would change a lot of how we approach things. We would not be so confident that we have all the right answers. And one of the things is when you're very confident you have all the right answers, it has a couple of implications. One of the implications, research shows this, is that when you're so confident you have all the right answers, you have a harder time understanding people who disagree with you, and you have a tendency to see them not as wrong but as evil. And thus you increase polarization. So, and then, when you're so confident, and I think you talked about this last night, when you're so confident that you have all the right answers, you tend to fear other people getting power, so much so that you may engage in activities that violate your own sense of moralities. Because you have to keep that power, because, you losing that power is not just about inconvenience. Unspeakable things will happen if you lose that power. And so you have to do whatever you can to keep that power. And there's research on terrorists, just terrorists, and that's a lot of what motivates what they do. So there's a lot of implications if we take seriously the theological implications of our faith. And unfortunately, I don't think we do often enough.
Yeah, I think it gives more personal humility, like you said, and an understanding of our own fallibility, our own depravity. But then once we go on a broader scale as well, it also makes us more willing whenever our side is in power.
Yes.
Whether that be the White House or Congress or whatever else. more.
Or in the Southern Baptist Convention right now.
True, yeah, even
Yeah.
outside of politics.
Yeah.
To understand that even our side needs to have checks to their power.
Yeah.
Because one thing that concerns me is authoritarianism growing on both sides of the aisle, I think, because they want us to remain in power, keep the other side from being in power.
Yeah.
And so resisting that authoritarian mindset, which says, well, if we could just be in control and then expand our control, then everything will be okay. And forgetting the depravity and why our founders, put checks and balances in the government, because they also believed in depravity. That's what drove them. So we're running out of time. The last question I want to ask you, and we have more questions. I'm sorry, guys. We'll work out our schedules to do a follow-up podcast so we can get to more questions. But the last one I want to ask you is, how do we put the gospel at the center of our racial conversations?
Yeah. Okay, so let me phrase this in this way. All right. We live in a post-Christian society right now. All right. So I'm sure you all are familiar with this. I mean, we used to be in a society where Christianity was sort of default. And if you went into town, you kind of felt like you had to find a church. Kind of felt like you had to, even if you didn't really go that often, but just to go every now and then and just say you're a member of a church. People don't feel that way anymore. People feel that, I can get what I need. I don't have to step foot in a church. Because we live in a post-Christian society. People are going to come to Christianity, come to us, if we offer them something they're not getting outside of our faith. I think this is one big avenue we can offer something they're not getting outside of our faith. What if, just imagine with me, what if Christians became known as the group that has these great conversations on racial issues and actually works out problems? People will come to look at what is it about Christianity that's doing that? What about people of this faith that's doing that? That will draw people. If we get our act together on racial issues, it has all sorts of implications as what we can do in a post-Christian world where people no longer feel the obligation to become somewhat involved with Christianity. But we have to get our act together. We have to figure it out. And like you said, we have to, as Christians, stop sounding like the rest of the world, being as polarized, and finding ways in which we can unite instead of argue with one another. So I do think that this is perhaps one of the ways God could use race to actually bolster who we are as Christians if we can do the hard work to learn the skills we need and to move forward. And plus, because our solution really is tied to a central component of the gospel, which is human depravity. As people come, and as we, perhaps teach them active listening and other things that are not directly spiritually based, but then how do we get here? We can talk about how we understand human depravity and why this is important. I think we really bring people closer to God, closer to Christ in that way.
Absolutely, good work. Well, thank you. Like I said, we have a lot more questions, but we're running out of time. Before we close this Q&A, I just really want to thank you for making the trip down here, especially to your family. Thank you to them for allowing you to come down here and be with us. Really appreciate it. Guys, remember, pick up the book. It's really worth the time and the read. A lot more fleshed out there, and we could even have more conversations together if we get this and continue this on beyond just one weekend. So would you guys give a very hearty thank you to George?
So we have one last thing. This isn't our typical Sunday format. For those of you who's your first time here, but Justin, if you want to come up. Last Sunday we voted as a congregation, as a church, to have Justin join us on the elder board and become the newest elder of Redeemer. And so we have a little installation ceremony. It's going to take like a minute, but to officially install Justin as an elder of Redeemer. So let me grab my paper real quick. And I'm just going to read a few things, and Justin's going to respond. And then towards the end here, I'm going to read a few things to you guys as the congregation, and you'll respond to those as well. And when we get to that, I'll let you know. But so, Justin, do you reaffirm your faith in Jesus Christ as your own personal Lord and Savior?
I do.
Do you believe the scriptures of the Old and New Testaments to be the Word of God, totally trustworthy, fully inspired by the Holy Spirit, the supreme, final, and the only infallible rule of faith and practice?
I do.
Do you sincerely believe the statement of faith and covenant of this church containing the truth taught in the Holy Scripture?
I do.
Do you promise that if at any time you find yourself out of accord with any of the statements in the statement of faith and covenant, you will, on your own initiative, make known to the pastor and other elders the change which has taken place in your views since your assumption of this vow?
I do.
Do you subscribe to the government and discipline of Redeemer City Church?
I do.
Do you promise to submit to your fellow elders in the Lord?
I do, with God's help.
Have you been induced, as far as you know your own heart, to accept the office of elder from love of God and sincere desire to promote His glory in the gospel of His Son?
I have.
Do you promise to be zealous and faithful in promoting the truth of the gospel and the purity and peace of the church, whatever persecution or opposition may arise to you on that account?
I do, with God's help.
Will you be faithful and diligent in the exercise of all your duties as elder, whether private or public, and will you endeavor by the grace of God to adorn the profession of the gospel in your manner of life and to walk with exemplary piety before this congregation?
I will, by the grace of God.
Are you now willing to take personal responsibility in the life of this congregation as an elder to oversee the ministry and resources of the church and to devote yourself to prayer, the ministry of the word, and the shepherding of God's flock, relying upon the grace of God in such a way that Redeemer City Church and the entire church of Jesus Christ will be blessed?
I am, with the help of God.
And now to you as a congregation, to this first statement where you reply with, "We do." And it says, do you, the members of Redeemer City Church, acknowledge and publicly receive this man as an elder, as a gift of Christ to this church? We do. And then respond to this one with, "We will." It says, will you love him and pray for him in his ministry and work together with him humbly and cheerfully, that by the grace of God you may accomplish the mission of the church, giving him all due honor and support in his leadership to which God has called him, to the glory and honor of God?
We will.
All right.
All right. Thanks.
So we're so thankful you joined us today for worship. If this was your first time here, we'd love to have you back next week. But again, thank you to George for leading us in that PowerPoint and discussion. We're so thankful for that. So as you go today, remember to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. You've been called, you've been equipped, and now you are sent. We love you, and we'll see you next week.
A little different, I'm on something new. 2 days.